So today I'm going to be walking you through on how to make a detailed depreciation schedule. This is going to be a simple example where we're only going to assess the straight line depreciation method, and we're going to be assessing a capital asset list with asset type, asset class, acquisition date, purchase price, depreciation method, and lastly salvage value. The goal is to have a detailed depreciation schedule and then consolidate that information so that we could return the total amount of depreciation expense that we can expect for 2024. Some complementary information that we have is the useful life information, which is based on the asset type. And we also have a depreciation rate, but this is only relevant for declining balance depreciation assets, which we don't have within this example. This practice is going to be very focused on using dates as an input within different functions. So if you're interested in that, this will be very helpful for you. Now, before we start, we need to bring in some critical information first. So I'm going to create an extra column here. I'm going to be calling this depreciable value. And what's important here is that because we have a salvage value, we only want to assess depreciation on the balance of the purchase price net of the salvage value. So I'm going to calculate the difference between purchase price and the salvage value first. And the next thing that I'm going to be doing is bring in the useful life. The useful life unit is within years, and I'm going to bring this in by using the XLOOKUP function, search the asset type, and bring in the useful life information. Now that we have the useful life, the next thing that we can do is calculate the end date. And to calculate our end date, we're going to use the eDate function, which returns the number of months after the start date based on the number that you specify. Our start date is going to be the acquisition date. And because we know that the useful life is within years, I'm going to multiply this by 12 for this input. And lastly, I'm going to layer in a if error function right on top, because I know for a fact that land assets are going to return an error. And now that we have this information, we can now begin building our detailed depreciation schedule. The way I'm going to build this is first use the min function on the acquisition start date so that I know exactly which month I have to start building out our schedule. Now that I have this month, I'm also going to use the end of month function, which will return the last date of a month based on the number that you specify. Now, for building out our schedule, I have an option to either use the end of month function, where it returns a month after, and just simply drag this across, or I can hard code this, copy it, press Alt-H-F-I-S, and open this series function, click rows, click months, and determine the month where I want to stop. And I want to stop on December 31st, 2024, because that is the end date of our depreciation schedule that we want to assess. And you'll notice that it generated me the headers for each month up until December 2024. And now we can begin working on our depreciation schedule. For a depreciation, we have to assess two factors. The first one being that the acquisition date has started within the period that we're assessing. And lastly, the end date is greater than the period we're assessing. Once these two conditions are met, then we know that this is an appropriate depreciation period. So if and the acquisition date is less than the current date, and I know that this works because I've already converted my headers to the last date of the month. And then for our second condition, we want end date to be greater than the end of month of the period we're assessing, minus 1 plus 1. And what I'm doing here is I'm converting the period that we're assessing to the beginning date. So the end of month is going to bring it back to the last date of the prior month. And by adding plus 1, it is then going to return the start date of the month above. And what these conditions are doing is I'm only going to be assessing depreciation if the acquisition date is below the last date of the month that we're assessing, and that the end date is greater than the first date of the month that we're assessing. And again, we have to be very careful of how we depreciate here, because this formula itself is going to depreciate over 1 month. So if we wanted to make this formula accurate, we can actually just do -2 plus 1 so that it stops 1 month prior to the end date, because we're essentially starting a month earlier. And once these conditions are met, we can then calculate the monthly depreciable value, which is the depreciable value divided by the period of its duration, which is the useful life times 12. And lastly, I'm just going to layer on an if error, because I know that land will be giving me trouble. And you'll notice that my depreciation schedule is now built out like this. And if you wanted to just make sure that it's organized, you can set up borders. And we have our depreciation schedule. And to consolidate the information, we're going to be using a sum product, where we want the period and assess the asset type. And for the asset type, we want B7, which is building. And for the period, we want to return D5. And you can see that we have our consolidated amortization schedule. And we have our depreciation schedule that's built from a detailed source that we can use to investigate further. A key takeaway here is when you're using dates as functions, it's very important that you're cognizant of the date itself, meaning that if you're analyzing February 2015, you also have to realize that the 20th plays a factor. So if you ever test a condition where February 19th, 2015 to February 20th, 2015, they're not going to equal and your function is not going to work. I hope this video helps, and if you have any questions, feel free to message me. And as always, follow for more Excel tips.